Hello, Peter.
Good morning.
How are you?
We are great. It's nice to be back here in this room. Nothing but nice memories.
This is a great festival. I've been honored. It's my first time here. I hope I get asked back. It's been a great thrill.
And you know,
Really has. Met so many.
our
incredible-
Godfather is in the first row.
That's right. That's right.
Bless him.
So, first of all, how is it conceivably possible that you were Robert Evans's number 2 man at Paramount in 1966 or 67?
Well, everything written about us and about the Godfather is essentially wrong.
All right, good. Well, we got 42 minutes to fix that.
So Evans and I were simply personal friends. He was a pal. He, at that point in his life, was a delightful person to be with. Very calm and serious. There was none of the celebrity nonsense had crept into his life. He basically felt that he was pursuing unsuccessfully a career as an actor. And one of the first things he said to me is, I realize I'm really untalented. And so we were friends. He liked what I was doing because I was then on the New York Times and I was covering Ronald Reagan and the Watts riots. And he sort of thought that I was pursuing a rather interesting lifestyle. And he became kind of a buddy.
You wrote a piece, a profile of him, right?
I wrote a piece for the New York Times in which I said that Hollywood is stuck and that all of the interesting young people who are trying to come to the fore are basically being banished. And I mentioned Evans in one paragraph because he had submitted a couple of interesting projects to studios and they bought the projects and not signed him as producer. So he was having a miserable time getting started as a producer. I basically wrote a piece about him saying that he was something of a failure. And oddly enough, it was read by people who thought he was an interesting failure.
It had a great headline, which was a quote from him that said, the headline in the New York Times piece was, I like it, I want it, let's sew it up.
That's right.
So, but no, so first of all, the talk in Hollywood when he was hired, this failed actor, I mean, to call him a pretty boy does a disservice to pretty boys. He was unbelievably handsome,
Yeah.
right? But he had been a failed actor, this good-looking failed actor, came from some money. The thought was he hadn't earned it, and then he hires as his number 2 a reporter, a journalist.
That's right.
Like, what the hell were you guys doing there?
Well, as he said to me, you know, the only friend I have who has even fewer credentials to run a studio than I, and therefore I think would make a good team. And in point of fact, we did, because I was the antithesis of a film nerd. I did not grow up with movies. I mean, Peter Bogdanovich, who was also a friend of mine, would have been much better at that job than me. I had no preparation for it. But Evans and I, oddly enough, had the similar tastes and somewhat similar backgrounds. So it meshed.
We met for the first time at a, well, I guess a memorial for Norman, but I was just taking Norman Lloyd, but as I'm taking notes for this, and I abbreviate you as PB. Peter was a friend of mine too, and that's how, of course, I used to abbreviate
That's right.
Peter Bogdanovich, a wonderful guy.
Norman Lloyd, you should say, was a great actor who died, I think, last year at the age of 113 or 14.
It was incredible.
And with whom I played tennis until he was 99.
Yeah, he had to stop at 99.
That's right.
That's crazy. Before we get into the specifics of Godfather, and we will, I think it's significant that you came aboard, you said, to Paramount in 66 or 67. I don't think Evans could have got away with hiring you. I don't think they would have hired Evans in 65.
That's right.
I mean, it was changing. The difference, you look at the movies, just take the pictures nominated for Best Picture in 1966, compare them with the movies nominated for Best Picture in 1967, and you realize, oh, everything has changed in Hollywood, and so there was a door was open for guys like you.
Well, the reason that Bob and I ended up doing what we did, the reason we were hired, I guess, is because the movie industry had failed, basically. And when the New York Times asked me to cover Los Angeles, they said, look, don't write about movies, because the movie industry is dead. So, you know, write about race, write about politics, you can have a good time. And of course, the New York Times was totally wrong in its analysis, which is not an unfamiliar phenomenon.
I was asking if that had happened since.
I realized that I started poking around and seeing people. I didn't write about movies, but then as I got involved in talking to people, I realized exactly what you just said. The business was changing. The studios were all broke, and therefore we had great opportunities to do radical things. And you know, Ben, oddly enough, one of the first meetings that when Bob and I sat down seriously, and 2 or 3 weeks after we started in our jobs, we got together at the old racket club, which then was quite a different entity. And we decided him and me, let's just figure out what we're going to do. The racket club in those days, everyone looked like Kirk Douglas or Natalie Wood, but everyone was Kirk Douglas or Natalie Wood. And it was a wonderful place to hang out. And we sat down and faced each other. And I said, Bob, you realize that we're totally fucked. We looked at, we had inheriting a series of movies that Charlie Bruton, the president of Gulf and Western, had agreed to. And they were all from what you rightly described as the previous era. Right. You know, Darling Lily starring Julie Andrews and Rock Hudson, who hated each other. And Paint Your Wagon, where you had the privilege of seeing Lee Marvin singing to Clint Eastwood. And
that's what I want in a motion picture. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
So it was all wrong. So Bob and I sat with each other, and I pointed out, I said, look, here's where my background as a reporter is a help. I probed what is happening to us, and if you notice, the furniture in your office and the furniture in my office is all rented furniture. And I checked on the leases. The studio, the permanent, the old timers at Paramount, rather than giving us the real studio, the wonderful studio furniture, they rented really crappy furniture on 9-month rentals. And I said that, Bob, what this proves to me is that the permanent party here expects we're going to last no longer than 9 months. And therefore, what we should do is cancel everything, basically, that's now in production and start over and build a slate.
How did that lead to Mario Puzo's The Godfather, and who agreed to give him $12,500 with the $50,000 more if it gets turned into a movie?
The number always evaded me. I think it was $35,000.
Fair enough.
Yeah. No. What Bob and I decided sitting at the Racket Club was that we were going to buy a whole new slate of novels and scripts that were more in keeping with the kinds of movies that at that moment was hitting. I mean, The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, movies of that era that were just starting in production were exciting.
Bonnie and Clyde.
And Bonnie and Clyde, absolutely.
Heat of the Night. These were different than 1966. Yeah.
So what I set about to do was to find novels and scripts that I felt would be in that sort of context.
Evans has said that one of the reasons why he picked you, in addition to being your friend and that you were less qualified than he was and he wanted that, was that you were just about the best read person he knew.
Yeah.
He wanted that.
But I think a more important quality for me was that I had gotten to know a lot of interesting young directors. And so we wouldn't just buy something, say, and go with one of the familiar old directors. We would, let's say I read True Grit, and I saw John Wayne sitting at the next table and at the commissary every day, and I would say to John Wayne, the Duke, I said, you know, why don't I'm going to give you a book, have someone read it, and let's make a different type. Let's make a different True Grit. And so basically every project that we acquired it for a different kind of director, an interesting young director. with Paper Moon with Bogdanovich. And I introduced a strange young Polish man named Roman Polanski to Bob because we had bought Rosemary's Baby, which was a brilliant thriller. But again, it was going to be made by a wonderful old timer named Bill Castle. Yeah. And we decided, what would happen if we gave it to Roman? It'd be a lot more interesting movie. In that context, when I first told Bob that I was really enamored of The Godfather, the first half of the book, Bob correctly said, I think it's a very well-written, interesting book. I don't want to get near it. And I said, well, why? And he said, because look at the gangster movies are old Hollywood. The only ones being made are things like The Brotherhood with Kirk Douglas, and Marty Ritt was directing. He said, what we have to do is new genre. I don't want to go back to gangsters. So being a pragmatic person, I felt this was our first disagreement about projects. So I said, look, think of The Godfather in a different way. We've all seen gangster movies over and over again. But what would happen if we made a gangster art movie? And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I mean, we make it for $6 million, not $60 million. And the director would be, there's this interesting young semi-Italian person named Francis Coppola. Why don't we lure him, because he would never make a picture in Hollywood. All his pictures were made off campus. What would happen if we got someone like Francis to do it? And we start with the idea that this is going to be an art movie about gangsters. I mean, that's the only way that we ended up starting. That was the point of view of the picture. And every element in it, the look of the picture, the cinematography, the art direction, everything that Francis entered into with was the idea that this was going to be a different kind of gangster movie.
How much pushback was there to having Francis direct this movie?
There was none at all, because it was sort of, everything we did was kind of secretive then. But a terrible thing happened just as we were about a month from production. The book came out, and it became the hottest bestseller in the world. And all of a sudden, people who never knew, people in my company who never knew about this, suddenly realized, oh shit, why are we entrusting this amazing project that everyone in the world is reading to an obscure director and a has-been actor like Brando? I mean, everything that we were doing, the board of directors of Gulf and Western was opposed to.
But before the book came out, they were less interested in it because it wasn't that big a deal.
They had no interest in it. They didn't know about it. Most of the things we were developing, the company itself didn't know about.
Yeah. So who, because some fairly big people, like it got sent to Warren Beatty, correct? Did he want to produce and direct it? And he's told me, he flippantly was like, no, this is terrible. Now he called Charlie Bludorn and said, I'm not interested.
Well, again, that's part of the mythology. I never gave it to Warren Beatty. As far as I knew, I was running the development of this project with Francis, and the only person he ever had in mind was Brando. And later, in later years, all these people emerged as having turned down The Godfather. I never offered it to any of those people, and I was the only person who could offer a deal. I mean,
for whatever it's worth, and it would make perhaps Warren's story true, is that he said Charlie sent it to him directly.
Yeah. See, that may be true.
Right.
Because Charlie Bludorn, again, after the book became famous, he began, of his own volition, to send it to stars and to directors. But being a very devious person, what I saw to it was if anybody that I didn't want took an interest in The Godfather, I had a deal offered them that would be insulting. So soon after being offered it, most of these people were disgusted and turned it down.
Right, you insulted them.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good business. Yeah.
Again, being a journalist, deviosity was an important trait for me.
So there is that's right. You gotta tell some lies. That's right. So it is true that then there became this significant pushback to Francis. there was a coup, right? I mean, the crew
Yeah.
essentially rebelled.
Well, and this was where my own mistakes began to come into view, because I was doing a lot of things wrong. For one thing, Francis and the producer I named Al Ruddy, never got along. And unfortunately, Bob and Francis never really got along. It was just not the wrong chemistry. And I realized, again, I was force-feeding a package that really wasn't getting along. And at one point, halfway through the picture, to my horror, I got a call from the production manager, Gray Fredrickson, saying that, Francis is leaving the picture. He's going to Paris to write a script. And I said, we're halfway into The Godfather. Why is he leaving? And Gray said, because he's convinced that he's going to be fired any day now. Evans hates the dailies. And I said, the only people who see dailies is Bob and I, and we love the dailies. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. So we called Francis, and I realized that he'd made his reservations to go to Paris, and he was quitting before being fired. And I realized the reason he was quitting was there was a production executive on the picture named Jack Ballard, who reported to me and to Bob. And Jack was screwing around with Francis terribly. He was cutting his budget. He was criticizing. He was walking on the set and berate him in the middle of shooting. And Francis was sick and tired. Francis had never made a Hollywood movie. He didn't want to make this in Hollywood. He wanted to shoot it in San Francisco. So what we realized was that Jack Ballard had to go. And, it was an easy call, because I liked Jack. I didn't realize he was screwing up so bad. So we made the call, and Francis didn't go to Paris, but he did start writing a script that he felt would be his next picture, and it was The Great Gatsby. And what he didn't know was that Truman Capote had already been hired to write The Gatsby. So again, this was a badly run studio, because it was run by Bob and me, and neither of us were brilliant managers. So,
and it was, but you still, in the end, there's such success that I'm dubious of that it was. Yes, I get that it was badly run, but I mean, in the end, you get Rosemary's Baby, you get Love Story, you get The Godfather, you get Chinatown. Like it came out okay.
Yeah, there were some really terrific things that were being started, because, as you said at the beginning, the times had changed. And Evans and I, our strength was that we understood the times had changed, and we liked the fact that the times had changed. I mentioned True Grit. One of the few times that I got overruled was when the Duke said to me, your choice of directors is bizarre. I don't know who these young guys are. I want Henry Hathaway. Henry Hathaway was a splendid old director, but he was exactly contrary to what we had imagined as the new. That's why I love the fact that years later, the Coen brothers decided they would do True Grit the way it should have been done, and did a much better job. But they didn't have Duke. And Don Wayne was a terrific actor, and actually, I thought, a terrific human being, as long as you didn't discuss Vietnam.
Right, you find there's I've met a lot of people who objected to Wayne's politics and loved him.
Yeah.
Like he's just one of those guys you just liked being around.
Yeah.
So it is true that Francis was in trouble. You think you waited a long time to fire Jack Ballard. One of your regrets is that you took as long as you did. You didn't.
Yeah.
You didn't.
Foolish.
He turned Francis's own editor, who'd edited a couple of his pictures, against him.
Yes. Francis had assembled a really interesting crew, but typical, some of you may have read about, he's on a picture now, which is, to a degree, he's at the age of 82 directing another movie.
Megaopolis.
And he's putting up the money for the movie. He's putting up $100 million to get this dream project of his made. And how can you not venerate someone with that kind of courage, except for the fact that if you talk, one of the joys of knowing Francis talking to his wife, who was a wonderful hippie lady from the 60s. And several times in their life together, she'd gone to the grocery store to do shopping and been told, you have no credit, you're broke. And she's lived with this over and over again, certainly on Apocalypse Now. I mean, Francis, once he gets started, he's such a flood of brilliant ideas that he contradicts himself and fires people, changes policy. He is a maddening person to work with. Also, a truly lovable, wonderful human being, a person, a great family man, great loyalty. But to work with him day to day on a picture is nightmarish.
What is myth and what is reality about Marlon Brando's casting? He did have to do a screen test, yes, which he nailed.
He did what he, as you know, he would always said, I never would put myself for a role. I never do a screen test. And then while we were preparing The Godfather, and I was getting shot down, no one in the company wanted to use Brando.
His previous pictures had been failures.
They all tanked. His last picture, the only person who might remember it, is a picture called Burned.
Yeah.
He'd made 3 or 4 awful movies in a row and had behaved badly. And so Brando, I suddenly learned that he and Francis are shooting a test. Now, he had invented a voice. He'd changed his jawline.
Real quick, let me interrupt. Had you and Evans said no to Brando earlier? Or you just knew it was a non-starter?
The company had said no.
Yeah.
I basically said, Francis wants him, we should go with him. And there was one long argument. But everybody in the cast, Jimmy Caan, Al Pacino, everybody was fighting over and frankly, at that point, I just stood back because I didn't want to be involved in casting arguments that I knew would be futile. Because if we went with Francis, we'd go with his cast. Yeah. He wanted Al Pacino. The problem with Al Pacino at that point was he looked like a young kid who was at Harvard. Right. He was a very clean-cut young man. You saw his pictures. He was a brilliant young actor. I didn't get it. Francis did. So my philosophy was go with Francis. Jimmy Caan kept saying, why would you hire a Jewish guy to play an Italian guy? I'm wrong for the role. And Francis and his casting guy, a wonderful man named Fred Roos, believed in Jimmy Caan. And they were right.
In the end, Francis got everybody he wanted.
He got everybody he wanted, and rightly so. But Brando was an extraordinarily difficult person. My theory about him, like a number of actors of that time, like William Holden and so forth, they didn't want to be an actor. They hated acting. They hated themselves as actors. Brilliant piece in the New Yorker was done about Brando a few years later, in which they explained his mentality and how he had contempt for acting and for actors and for himself, was at war with himself throughout a movie. And on The Godfather, even the first week, it was a scene where they had this brilliant idea, I think it was Brando's idea. He'd do this great scene holding a cat. But the trouble was, Francis wanted to shoot it so dark, with the sound so low, that when we ran dailies, we did hate it. And I called Francis. I said, all I hear is the cat. I don't hear Brando. And
you could hear the cat meowing.
Meowing, yeah, that's right.
This random studio cat.
Yeah, it was a horrible scene, and you couldn't see it anyway. Evans kept taking off. He said, I feel like I'm wearing sunglasses. Why is it so dark? But Francis's concept was to shoot it dark.
So I read an interesting quote from you to Francis, and I think this gives people real insight into how movies are made. And I think, in my mind, I love Francis too, and he knows so much about so many things, right? But it seems like Francis had these preconceived notions about Evans, that he couldn't possibly know what he's talking about, right? Even though it turned out, if you handle Evans right, he had a lot of interesting things to say. But what you said to Francis was, hey man, look, you're shooting everything really dark. If that's what you had wanted, you got to tell me so I can prepare Evans. I can prepare the Paramount execs so that they know and it doesn't seem like you don't know what you're doing. You've got to trust me. I'm on your side.
Yeah.
It was hard to convince Francis, I think, that there were people at the studio who were on his side.
Absolutely right. And Ben, you really have insight into the process.
That's right, I do.
And you know one important fact. It's hard, even as I talk about this, I cringe a little bit because it sounds like what happens on every big movie, credit taking.
Right.
You know, as I talk about it, even as you talk about it, it sounds like we really knew what was going on, and it was, we did it. You know, but Francis Coppola directed it. He couldn't have written it without Mario Puzo. That was a wonderful chemistry. And Mario's a great novelist.
They loved it. They kind of fell in love with each other.
They did.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned to me as we were coming on, the relationship between Francis and Evans was simply hopeless. They really instinctively distrusted and disliked each other. And I was in the uncomfortable position of being the person that Bob would say, tell this to Francis, and vice versa, and went on that way throughout the movie. And it was discomforting. But to my exasperation, a few years after The Godfather, Evans said, you know, I've decided to do that movie with Francis. And it was the worst idea of all time.
Which was the Godfather 2?
No, I've repressed the name of the movie. What was the movie that?
Oh, the Francis lost all his money on.
Yeah.
The
God, I've
Huh?
No,
the one after Apocalypse Now.
the one after.
Right? Not Apocalypse Now.
Can anyone help us? What was a movie that Francis directed and Evans produced, and was almost unreleasable, but then was recut?
That's right, and recut.
Cotton Club.
That's right, the
Bless
Cotton Club.
you.
That's not even what I was thinking of, but yes,
Yeah.
the Cotton Club.
And then, you know,
it
but
redone
Cotton Club,
pretty effectively when Francis
was-
re-released it.
Yeah, but it's a terrible movie. It doesn't work.
And also a very strange decision for those guys to jump back into bed together.
Yeah, and immediately from week 2, they were not on speaking terms.
Yeah,
again.
it's great. It's a great decision. So Brando did the screen test, but the screen test blew everybody away. Like, you saw what's great about Brando.
The screen test was brilliant. I mean, he had even invented some dialogue and invented, as I say, his voice. And it was an
And
extraordinary.
the cotton in the mouth,
Yeah.
all that stuff.
So Bob rightly decided that the best way to handle the situation was to arrange a meeting between Francis and Charles Bludon, who was the great conglomerator who owned Gulf and Western, and who, upon the success of The Godfather and Love Story, changed the name of the company to Paramount. But basically, Charlie Bludon disagreed with everything we did at every step of the way, and thought Love Story was the worst idea for a movie ever. And I remember distinctly one of my unpleasant experiences with Bludon. Had a very heavy German accent, and was somewhat Hitlerian in the way he ran his company. But I find myself on week 1 of Love Story with Charlie in his limousine, driving around Manhattan. And he was talking to me about what a disaster it was. Why did he ever buy Paramount? How did he get himself into this horrible mess? And we pass a theater with Love Story, and there's a line around the block. And Charlie says to me, what is this? Is there another picture playing here? What is the line for? And so I said, this is Love Story. It is a huge hit, and this is day 2. And Bludon said, this couldn't be happened to. Look at this line. He bursts out of the limousine and goes up to a sort of sad-looking young man who was the manager of the theater. And he goes up and he grabs him by the lapel of his jacket and he says, what are you doing? Look at this line. So I said, I know, it's wonderful. I said, but don't just stand there like a schmuck. Raise the prices.
It's the greatest story I've ever heard. So how did with the obstinance of Bluthorn, how did we get to the point where it all came together so effectively? Is that is ultimately, I think, that's Francis? Yeah.
Bluthorn, yes, but Bluthorn, when he saw this test, was riveted. He said, "I'm wrong. He is a brilliant actor. Why has he done nothing but failure in the movies? Why have all his pictures failed?" So I said, "I can't answer that, but let's make a terrible deal with him. Let's pay him less money and give him fewer points. If you dislike his past so much, let's screw him." And so I didn't think much of it, but Bluthorn did, being Bluthorn, come up with a horrible deal. And it cost Brando, I think, $5 to $6 million, because Bluthorn hated him retroactively. And of course, everybody, a lot of people made extraordinary money, including Francis from The Godfather.
I imagine that whatever Brando would have made just would have been blown in some new and interesting way.
Yes, he lived a difficult life.
So, and Pacino went through the first half of the production, certain each day that he was about to be fired.
Yes, and he was finding his way into this role. But he's a genius. He's a brilliant young actor. And as the dailies went along, they got better and better. And you could see a remarkable movie. But you know, people sometimes ask me at that time, when you've lived through several movies that were surprise hits, did you know that going in? And you know, I honestly, number one, being an ex-journalist, my first view of everything was skeptical. I always thought everything was going to fail. And then when I see the first cut, I was convinced it was going to fail. And one of the wonderful traits of Evans that no one ever wrote about or appreciated, he was brilliant at seeing a movie and suggesting changes in that movie that could make the film better. I would see the third or fourth cut of a movie and become exasperated. And Bob would say, "No, what happens if we do this? Change the ending and so forth, do some reshooting." And of course, we're time and again in a situation which is the worst the worst time in a studio, when you face each other and say, to reshoot that week would be $5 million. Someone, are you going to do it? Do you believe in this movie enough to do it? I mean, even Love Story was a disaster in his first cut. And the idea of reshooting a scene in Love Story was, even though I was its biggest advocate, was nauseating. I didn't want to go for another $5 million. But, you know, that's what you had to bite the bullet and realize where the mistakes were made and how, through reshooting and re-editing, you could save one picture after another.
The most interesting time for me on The Godfather, in the story of The Godfather, is the where Evans and Francis's relationship, I think, hit its nadir, which was in post-production, really after Francis edited the movie. He hands in a cut, I think it's just under 3 hours, like 2 hours and 53 minutes. And the studio reacts incredibly, I mean the executives, the board, they react incredibly poorly and demand that it be cut down and ultimately don't flinch, right? And so the thought was, okay, go back to the drawing board, you need to make this picture a lot closer to 2 hours.
That's right.
The head of foreign, I love there's a quote here from the head of the European unit, which is the head of foreign distribution, "Too talky, no action, will never play in Europe."
That's right.
That was part of the reaction to the 2 hour, 53 minute cut. So it goes down to 2 hours and 15 minutes, and what happens?
Well, the then president, a newly elected president of Paramount, was in the middle of the picture, was named Frankie Blance, who was a distribution person. And
He once said he didn't really like movies.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. He didn't like the movie.
Yeah.
Was convinced that it would not work. And it was only months later I realized all of his instincts were basically incorrect. At one point, Evans was desperate to make Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand. And Yablans said, "Look, I have called every distribution around the world, every head of distribution in territory after territory, And no Jewish movie star would ever succeed in being a successful movie star. And that's what he would announce. And I was thinking, so you call distribution head in Albania and you say, what's your opinion of Jewish movie stars? The whole idea was, again, manic. But that's basically what we were confronting there. And Evans was brilliant at handling Blue Dawn and dealing with his Hitler-like traits.
So what happens there? And they
Well, so Yablans insisted that it be 20 minutes shorter.
I think more, like ended up being 38 minutes short.
Something like that. And Francis was told to edit it. And then Francis came in with his shortened version. And Bob saw it and said, and he was absolutely right, I said the same, you know, you've taken a good picture that you wrote and directed and edited, and you've turned it into a boring movie. Because the shorter Godfather lost its nuance, lost its energy. And so he insisted, Bob said, look, we're going to cancel the Christmas date. We had a prize Christmas date. And we should cancel it. And I'm going, at that point, he had such a bad back, he couldn't get out of bed, really. Edison said, I personally am going to re-edit this picture. Now, number one, I died a little because my favorite picture that I was pushing along was called Harold and Maude. And we had a, bless you. And we had a great Christmas date. I thought that might be a cool picture because it was, again, the kind of radical change.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a ridiculous movie to make 2 years before. Yeah. But at this moment, you could get away with Harold and Maude and Ruth Gordon falling in love with an 18-year-old boy. Mm-hmm. And the romance, remember, was consummated. It was a ridiculous idea for a movie. But it was, Bob was re-editing. And what he was doing, without realizing it, was putting back the cuts that Francis had made against his will. And what Bob did, and he would freely admit this, and you remember this, he confided in a journalist named Joyce Haber, who had a column in the LA Times. And Bob, in a moment of weakness, said, you know, I am recutting Francis' picture because the cut doesn't work. He didn't mean to say that, but that was what little remained of the relationship between Bob and Francis was destroyed at that point. And indeed, what was being done subconsciously was that Francis' original brilliant cut of The Godfather was being restored. And the movie, with a March opening, was suddenly working. Whereas those few of us who had seen the cut movie realized that it was really, the movie was failing. And that's what's scary about, you've lived through this, you've run and run the interviews. What's so scary is how fragile a film is. Cut a different way, cast a different way. What films that you and I admire, venerate, can be disasters.
One of the things Evan said in that moment of screening the 2 hour and 15-minute version is that I'm watching the 2 hour and 15-minute version. He's on the phone. He's like, it's longer than the 2 hour and 53-minute version.
That's right.
But basically, he's quoted as saying, I just ran it at 2:15. It stinks. Do this at 2:15, and I'm walking, and you can close the fucking studio.
That's right.
Bye.
Yeah.
So even, and your point is that essentially both Francis and Evans are right about what happened. Evans did recut it. I'm sure Francis didn't think he was capable of it. But what he basically did was restore the 2 hour and 53-minute original version and maybe lengthened a couple of scenes, shortened a couple others, but it was pretty much Francis's cut.
But again, to get back to where we started, you know, the idea of the picture was radical, and that is, given this moment, this amazing moment, we were going to make an art movie. And as such, the movie, A, was going to be very long, and was going to play long. B was going to be cast in a radical way. Everything about the movie was going to be different. Even the way the assassinations occurred were different. It was going to be a radically different movie. It was going to be an art movie. That was the intention going in. Now, Evans knew that dirty little secret and agreed with it. And at the time, nobody in the studio understood that. And you don't say something like that. I mean, I remember we were remember a picture called Paper Moon. And the whole idea from day one was just in black and white. But you never say that in a studio. It was like so many of the pictures of that time at that place were secrets. You didn't tell people the sinister idea that you had behind that movie.
Well, Charlie and the board, those guys weren't radicals. They were there before. You guys were who came in were the radicals.
Yeah.
So, so you knew not to tell the establishment the radical things that you were about to do.
Yeah, and yet anybody looking at the industry at that time could realize the radical change. The audience was sick and tired of the old movies, Elvis Presley westerns. That's what Paramount was making. I think there were 2 or 3 of those. They didn't want to see Paint Your Wagon or Darling Lady, or the audience changed, and the audience was speaking to us. And you know, once again, it was a help to me be a journalist, because being a journalist, you could afford to pay attention. I wasn't part, nor was Evans. I was part of that Hollywood establishment using the same plots and the same formulas and the same directors, and putting Elvis Presley, who actually was a great guy to talk to, putting Elvis in a Western. He didn't want to be in Westerns. Right. So we could conspire and do radical things. Some of the things were a little too radical. And there were a number of pictures where we just frankly buried the pictures. No one ever saw them. And there were some things that I thought were brilliant ideas. There were horrible ideas. And the same for Evans. One of the arguments that
We got about a minute left. So.
One of the arguments that Bob and I had was the whole role of sex in movies. Hollywood was a very sexy time, but it was not a good time to make sexy movies. And Bob committed to, I remember, the Tropic of Cancer. And you know, no one wanted to see sex in movies. They wanted to see movies that were brilliant and as such were sexy.
Right, that's a significant distinction. I want to leave with 2 very quick thoughts. One, just to buttress the points Peter and I are making. Best Picture winner in 1966, A Man for All Seasons.
Yeah.
Best Picture winner in 1967, In the Heat of the Night, where Sidney Poitier slaps a white man in the movie.
So true.
Right. So
well
tells
said.
you, and then the title of what Peter says is one of the best books about the Godfather, Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli. Richard Castellano, who played Clemenza in The Godfather, the line that Mario and that was scripted by Francis, which is he should say to the hitman, "Leave the gun," and they'd had a bag of cannolis in there, and Richard Castellano on his own says, "Leave the gun," sees the bag of cannolis, and he goes, "Take the cannoli."
Right.
And that's it, and becomes nobody. I had no idea that he had just ad-libbed one of the great movie lines of all time.
And by the way, the one question that we forgot to discuss, that's in one sentence, everything in the offer, the television show about the Maya, every single thing in the offer was untrue. Every detail. It's like every meeting that we had never took place on the lot, because the lot, Paramount, had been sold to a Mafia organization. Mm-hmm. So Evans and I left to an office in Beverly Hills and refused to shoot at the offer all took place at Paramount. I just wanted to throw that one thing in.
So thank you. Peter Bart, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.
Ben.
Thank you,
Thanks
Peter.
so much.
Great stuff. Thank you.